Fans, what's going on? It's Anthony Cosenza with the Orange and Black Insider. Episode 3 is in the books. This show is moving forward, and we are uh, excited about all of the growth that we've seen over the past couple of episodes, and there's more news on that. And part of that growth is in bringing in our very first guest in this podcast, and it is Ted Glover from the Daily Norseman. He is the editor over there. He does a lot of different stuff, and he's going to help us talk about the upcoming preseason game number 1 with the Bengals and the Vikings. Again, it's Anthony Cosenza. I'm joined with my usual co-host Scott Schulze and Connor Howe. But Ted Glover, I'm going to let you talk about yourself, your role with the Daily Norseman, and some of the ways that Bengals fans and other Vikings fans who might be tuning in can follow you and what you're doing at the website.
Thanks, Anthony, and hello, Bengal Nation. Good to see you, or meet you, or talk with you. Kind of feel like we're making history here, which I don't know if that's a good thing since I'm your first guest.
You should feel very important. VIP, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Answer to a trivia question in 20 years.
There you go. Yeah.
No, like Anthony said, my name's Ted Glover. I write for the Daily Norseman, the Minnesota Vikings SB Nation site. You can find the website on Twitter at Daily Norseman. You can find me on Twitter at Purple Buckeye. I'm a Vikings and Ohio State fan. Long story there. Nobody wants to hear it, I'm sure. We also have a podcast. We actually have a couple podcasts over on Daily Norseman. The one I'm involved with, we just started up. It's called Roughing the Podcast with one of the other front page writers, Di Murphy. You can find that show on Twitter at Rough the Podcast, and our other podcast is Norse Code at Norse Code DN. So we actually have a couple different podcasts over there. I write and do the podcast and talk about all things Minnesota Vikings.
Well, thanks for joining us. Yeah, I mean, you like I said, you should feel very special, Ted. I mean, you are the very first guest on this podcast, so we are excited to have it. It's kind of a big deal. Yep. We are very excited to have you on. Absolutely. No, thanks for the time. I appreciate it. So I'm going to start off with, obviously, there are many, many, many connections with the Bengals and the Vikings, and a lot of them stemming from Mike Zimmer, the former Bengals defensive coordinator, who is now the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, landed there for the 2014 season. He's been there a couple years. The Vikings went to the playoffs last year. Just overall impressions of him as a coach. I know a lot of Bengals fans really loved what he brought to the team. Obviously, he and Marvin Lewis built up the defense here. It looks like he's doing the same with the Vikings. Talk about the culture change, if any, that Mike Zimmer has brought, and some of the positive steps you've seen the franchise take since he's taken over.
I love Mike Zimmer. I don't know if you guys had heard, but he just got a contract extension, I think, last week. I think it was a 3-year deal, but the Vikings never really released the terms of that deal. But I hope he's the Minnesota Vikings coach for a long time. He's brought in an accountability that I don't know that the Vikings had under Leslie Frazier. Leslie Frazier was a good guy. Loved by his players, well respected among his peers in the NFL. But towards the end of the Frazier regime, there was just this lack of enthusiasm, I guess, if you will, and a lack of accountability. I don't know if that's the right word, but there were excuses every week. The Vikings, you'd watch them collapse in the 59th minute and lose a game, and you'd hear the normal, typical end of game press conferences, your typical Frazier stuff as well. We saw some good things on tape, and we'll correct our mistakes, and now we'll move on to whoever our next opponent is. And Mike Zimmer is the antithesis of that. He is a fiery guy, an emotional guy that, for a modern day NFL coach, wears his emotions on his sleeve about as much as an NFL coach does, and it's refreshing. He'll call players out and say, "Hey, this guy does some things really good, but he needs to work on this." Or a former player that they cut at the end of last year had some early season injuries, kind of in the doghouse, and he had the famous "you can't make the club in the tub" comment about the guy. And he one of his, I'm sure you guys know these Zimmer isms, if you will, is don't tell me about the baby, show or don't tell me about the labor, show me the baby. So I
Yeah.
mean, he just is this quote machine that you just love, and he brought this enthusiasm and this attitude that the Minnesota Vikings were sorely lacking, especially on defense.
Ted, I just want to say thanks for coming on. There is two questions actually that I wanted to ask you about the Vikings now that they are in town practicing with the Bengals. And the first question is a local kid, Kyle Rudolph, who grew up in Cincinnati, went to Elder High School, was a high pick, a lot of expectations, just never seemed to be able to stay healthy. Now that it seems like he's healthy again, he finally played 16 games last year. What are Vikings' expectations for Kyle Rudolph this year?
They're very high. The Vikings signed Rudolph to I think it was a $25 million extension right before or right as camp was beginning in 2014. And quite frankly, he hasn't lived up to that money. In 2014, he was injured. He missed 8 or 9 games. I'd have to look it up to be sure, but he missed a fair amount of time. Last year, he was healthy for most of the season, but for good parts of the season, the tight end position, and it wasn't really just Rudolph, it was whoever they were playing at tight end, just sort of disappeared. You could look at a couple different reasons why. The Vikings were a very run-oriented team. When they went back to pass protection wasn't very good at all, and a lot of times the tight end they were using as an extra blocker. So there weren't as many opportunities as I don't think the Vikings would have liked. But Minnesota went ahead in the offseason and they made a couple steps in free agency and in the draft to improve the offensive line, and hopefully that will get Kyle Rudolph back to the pass catching, playmaking tight end that they envisioned him to be when they drafted him.
Speaking of tight ends, I know that Norv Turner has kind of been known as almost a tight end whisperer, and obviously he's the offensive coordinator in Minnesota. And as a San Diego resident, I can say that most Charger fans and most people who have ever encountered him don't think of him that highly. What's your opinion on Turner? Because I know that there's you have to have something to be an NFL offensive coordinator, let alone head coach at one point in his career. So, do you like him? And what about him would you say is the pros and the cons?
The pros. I mean, I get why Chargers fans don't like him. There are some guys that are great assistants in the NFL and just for whatever reason aren't meant to be head coaches. Is Norv Turner that guy? I don't know. He had kind of a run of success as the Chargers head coach, kind of a little bit of a run of success as the Redskins head coach. But yeah, I can see why Chargers fans soured on him. I like him compared to what the Vikings had prior to Norv Turner arriving. I think he's done a good job with the Vikings offense until the first year. Last year, I don't know that you can blame a lot of the issues on Norv Turner. There's some things that frustrate me about him. He has this penchant for example, the Vikings will be in the middle of a pretty good drive. 6-7 plays. They started deep in their own territory. They're now on the opponent's 30-35. Things are clicking, and they're looking like a well-oiled machine. And for whatever reason, Norv Turner will call this weird trick play that either loses 10 yards, causes a fumble, and now the drive is just shot. That's kind of irritating. I think he relies too much on running the ball with Adrian Peterson, or he did last year. Again, that might be attributed to the fact that the passing attack he likes to use is more of a 5 to 7 step drop, deep pass, medium and deep throws, and that really wasn't a successful part of Minnesota's passing game last year because of protection issues and Teddy Bridgewater, deep ball accuracy. But I think, in the offseason, the Vikings brought in Tony Sperano, former Dolphins coach, Raiders interim coach, offensive line coach, and he's been a guy that's looked at their offense and both Zimmer and Turner have said, look, it was a good thing that we brought him in, because he gives us a new look at things, a new way to look at things, new wrinkles we can put in. So I like Turner, but I also like the fact that they brought in Tony Sperano, because I think he's going to bring a fresh set of eyes, if you will, to the offense, and be able to maybe add some things to the Vikings offense we hadn't seen.
Yeah, there must be something in the water in South Bend with their tight ends. Talented guys can catch passes and everything, but they can't stay healthy. It's kind of a weird weird stigma as they get to the NFL. Again, it's Anthony Cosenza, Scott Schulze, Connor Howe, and we are joined by Ted Glover of the Daily Norseman on the Orange and Black Insider. Thanks again, Ted, for your time. I think, again, we talked about connections between the Bengals and the Vikings as we open this segment. Talk about Andre Smith. Obviously he was a free agent. He was with Cincinnati for quite some time. He had his roller coaster of a career here. There were times where he was an absolutely dominant tackle, times where he couldn't stay healthy, and times where he just didn't play very well against certain pass rushers. So what has he looked like in camp? If I remember correctly, I think Phil Lodeholt recently retired, who might have been competing with some time with him. I could be wrong about that, so feel free to correct me on that. But what have been the impressions of Andre Smith so far?
An upgrade. And that was, like you mentioned, Phil Lodeholt, the longtime right tackle for the Vikings, blew out his Achilles. First or second preseason game last year, missed the entire year. Was supposed to come back and compete with T.J. Clemmings, who replaced Lodeholt last year, and then Andre Smith. Phil just said he couldn't do the things he needed to do to play in the NFL, so he retired a week or two before camp started. So what was supposed to be a pretty spirited competition for the starting right tackle job kind of went to Smith by default, because Clemmings, although he gave it a heck of an effort last year, he just was not ready for the NFL. Struggled immensely at times, and although the 1 year of experience helped him, I just think he still needs some more time before he can compete for a starting job. As to Smith, he's looked good for the most part. He's had kind of an inconsistent camp at times, which you kind of chronicled with his days in Cincinnati. I was personally excited about the Smith signing because he had the greatest combine gif ever with the Moob 40-yard dash way back in the day. I mean, that's just a gift that keeps on giving if you're a blocker.
Yep, absolutely.
He was
But in all
Moob
seriousness,
for a long time here.
Save that one on your phone for any time the Vikings have a negative run play.
All right, I will do that. But no, I think the Vikings brought him in to be an upgrade, and he's healthy, and he's also a guy that they brought in on a 1 year deal. So they're also doing kind of a prove it year for Smith to prove to us that you can play. And I bet if he does, the Vikings will look to get him to a contract extension.
No, we were just talking a player that the Bengals had. One player the Bengals might have had was a wide receiver. The Bengals were obviously looking wide receiver this year in the draft, and there was that huge run of wide receivers that went right before them. You had Corey Coleman, then you had Will Fuller and Josh Doxson, and the Vikings took Laquan Treadwell. And one thing I was looking at, which kind of surprised me, is the Vikings have now taken 4 wide receivers in the first round from the SEC in the last 10 or 12 years, with Troy Williamson back in 2005, Percy Harvin, Cordarrelle Patterson, and then Laquan Treadwell this year. So the question I had is kind of based on the success or somewhat success of some of those guys. What have the fans seen in camp, or the team seen in camp, from Treadwell that has them maybe more excited than they may have seen from Williamson or Patterson? And that, hey, this could be the guy we've been looking for?
Well, it's kind of I hate to joke, but it's kind of an easy comparison, Treadwell to Troy Williamson, because Laquan Treadwell can catch the ball, which is a pretty important requirement for a wide receiver. For Cordarrelle Patterson, it's kind of a frustrating thing. When he was drafted in 2013, I think it was, he had that run at the end of the season. The Vikings were in the midst of a terrible year, but that last month of the season, Patterson was one of the leading receivers in the NFL, and that never translated to 2014 and 2015 for a myriad of reasons. He's kind of been in Mike Zimmer's doghouse. As you guys well know, for Mike Zimmer, if you're not going to get by on talent, you're gonna participate. You're gonna have to know your job. You're gonna have to know what you're doing. And I think Patterson, and he kind of admitted this, is that he just tried to use just get by on his natural ability, which you can do at a place like Tennessee, even in a conference as good as the SEC. But in the NFL, you can't do that. And he didn't put in the time and the effort and what was asked of him. I mean, for example, last offseason, the Vikings, by multiple reports, had asked Michael Irvin to work with Patterson in the offseason, and Irvin goes back to the Dallas days with Mike Zimmer. And Patterson said, you know what, no, I'm going to pass on that. And, and that just really said a lot to a lot of people about, where Patterson was. And this offseason, he said he rededicated himself, and by all accounts, he worked hard. Mike Zimmer praised him in the offseason, and the very first day of camp, he hurt his shoulder, and he missed almost a full week of practice. So with Treadwell, I think what you get is a big body. He's a big guy. He's not this 4.240 guy, but the Vikings offense doesn't need that. They need a guy that is good at route running, that will be at the spot he's supposed to be when the ball is released, and will catch the ball and go for contested balls. I think you talk about Fuller and Doxson and the other guys in the first round. I think Treadwell, with his skill set, he's not the fastest guy, but he is the guy that is best suited for this offense, and I think he's going to be a huge asset to the Vikings in this year and years to come.
Yeah, I was definitely pretty jealous of the Vikings when they grabbed Treadwell. He was one of the guys I was really high on. A little bit unrelated question, but the Vikings seem to be courting the Bengals safety George Iloka in free agency, and obviously the Bengals were able to lock him up to a pretty relatively team-friendly deal for what the safeties in the market were getting paid for. And the Vikings, I know they signed Sendejo before, or however you pronounce it, before the courtship of Iloka, but they were still, it seemed, courting Iloka even though they had Sendejo I think he's making $4 million a year. So I'm just curious. You obviously have Harrison Smith. I think adding Iloka could have potentially given the Vikings, if not the best safety duo in the entire NFL, one of the best. Obviously, it has to be frustrating, but do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts on the situation? Do you think it was a huge loss? Do you think it was something that they can overcome? Just what are your thoughts?
Overcome, yeah, they can overcome it. I mean, the Vikings had a top 5 or 10 defense with Andrew Sendejo last year. The Iloka thing was really puzzling to me. Going into the offseason, the one huge thing I thought the Vikings needed to address was the safety position opposite Smith. Michael Griffin doesn't really seem to be that guy. I mean, unless it's 2010 or 2011. Iloka was out there. There was also a couple other safeties out there that I thought the Vikings might try and make a run at, but they didn't, and instead they turned around and like you mentioned, gave Andrew Sendejo a pretty healthy contract extension. I was not a fan of that. Although that said, he's not bad in run support. His weak area is always going to be pass coverage. What the Vikings did do in the draft was draft a guy out of Clemson named Jaron Kearse, who a lot of people thought would be a top pick going into the draft, and for whatever reason, he had a terrible year at Clemson in 2015, and fell to the 7th round when the Vikings got him. And the word out of camp is that Kearse has been pretty good, and he was actually working in that joint practice today with the Bengals. He was actually working with part of the first team defense for a while. So I think Sendejo is going to be the guy. I think, however, if they're going to look to replace him, it's either going to be Kearse or maybe Anthony Harris, another backup safety on the Vikings. But yeah, they're going to go with Sendejo for now, and why they didn't go after Iloka, that was not frustrating, not just for me, but for a lot of Vikings fans.
Again, we're joined by Ted Glover of the Daily Norseman, part of the SB Nation network of blogs, the Vikings blog. Ted, we'll kind of close with this, and you may have a number of observations and things to answer with my question here, but as we mentioned, obviously both teams, the Vikings and the Bengals, are opening up their preseason with the first game against each other in Cincinnati. So what are you looking for from the Vikings' perspective in terms of outcomes of the game and what you hope the Vikings get out of it, as well as maybe some matchups that you'll be looking for, even though starters may not play all that long in this first game?
First and foremost, and this is for both teams, I don't want to see anybody get hurt. I
saw no more of that. No more of that, please.
Yeah, I saw you guys had a defensive tackle hurt today. Hopefully it's not serious. But what I'm looking at is primarily the offensive line, and Matt Khalil and Andre Smith. You know, they brought in Alex Boone. Looks like John Sullivan is going to start, and Brandon Fusco is going to start at right guard, or is projected to be. But the weak links last year were right tackle and left tackle. So I want to see how Matt Khalil performs. I want to see how Andre Smith performs. And then I want to see the Vikings, practice, some deep stuff, because that was the main legitimate criticism of Teddy Bridgewater last year, an inaccurate deep ball. So if they're going to take some shots downfield with the offense, I would like to see that and see how that goes. But overall, predictions for the game, I don't care. It's preseason. I'm just excited that football's back. And then I'll think, once the third string guys are in to start the third quarter, yeah, okay, let's get on to the regular season. But yeah, no injuries. I'm looking for Matt Khalil. I'd like to see what Laquan Treadwell does as well, just to see his debut. And then the rookie Mackenzie Alexander. On defense, I mentioned Alexander, but also Trey Waynes, who was the first-round pick last year, cornerback out of Michigan State. Didn't really play a whole lot. They really brought him along slow. And it looks like he might be neck and neck with your old friend Terrence Newman, who had a really good year with the Vikings last year, has not really looked good in camp. And Waynes may have a legitimate chance here. With Newman not making the trip, I think he's nursing a hip injury. With Newman not making the trip, it looks like Waynes has an opportunity to vault him in the depth chart. So we'll see how that goes as well.
Awesome. Great stuff, Ted. I appreciate you coming on the show. I know it's a little bit of a short notice, but appreciate your time. And just one more time, where can people follow you either on Twitter and find some of your stuff as well as your podcast that you mentioned earlier?
You can find my rantings and ravings in electronic print on dailynorseman.com, which is the SB Nation Minnesota Vikings site. I co-host a podcast on there called Roughing the Podcast with another front page writer, Di Murphy. You can find us on Twitter. You can find the site at Daily Norseman. You can find me at Purple Buckeye. You can find my co-host Di at Di Murphy MN. And we will be on doing our podcast every week during the season, and we'll be posting stories throughout the year.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Again, Ted Glover with the Daily Norseman joining us. He's the editor over there, and he's doing a lot of good stuff. So even if it's for the weekend, follow him and check out the material that they have as the Bengals and the Vikings clash for preseason game number 1. Ted, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Hey, before I go,
yeah,
the Twitter handle for the podcast is at Rough the Podcast.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Guys.
Yep.
You bet.
All right, so big thanks to Ted Glover, who joined us from the Daily Norseman, talking about the Vikings, giving us a little insight into the other side of the fence, a little peek over the other side of the fence, and finding out a little bit more about the Vikings themselves. And then obviously, as I mentioned, there's a lot of Bengals connections with the Vikings there, certain players, coaches that are there. So good stuff from Ted. Give him a follow and check all of his stuff out at the Daily Norseman. We're going to get to our preseason game number 1, things we'll be looking for. But before we do, there is a number of pieces of news that have been coming out of Bengals training camp, and some of it has been positive, and yet again, it's kind of that dreaded thing that happens again this time of year as training camp kicks off, and it's the injury bug. The Bengals last week they unfortunately lost their first round pick, William Jackson III, the cornerback out of Houston. They lost him for a significant period of time. We don't know exactly what the amount of time will be, but he did tear a pectoral muscle and had some surgery to repair that. And now another big contributor that the Bengals were probably even more so than Jackson, that the Bengals were looking to rely on in 2016 is fourth-round pick Andrew Billings, the defensive tackle out of Baylor. He had his leg crumbled up upon in the joint practice with the Vikings on Wednesday and was carted off of the field, could not get up under his own power. But later on Wednesday afternoon, Bengals.com editor Jeff Hobson noted that there's cautious optimism that Billings could come back at a pretty short window of time. The biggest fear was potentially a cartilage tear. If anything, he's having an MRI on Thursday. So, Scott, I'll kick that over to you. What do you think the fallout is, and how the Bengals would try and recover if Billings was to miss a significant period of time?
Yeah, this was one I was just crushed when I heard it, because I heard this on the way home on the radio, on the local sports radio here, and that was one of the first things I heard when I turned the radio on, was Billings was carted off the field. And like you said, after William Jackson going down just last week, the last thing we needed is another first-round pick being hurt. And the worst thing about it is all the hype all the fans had before the draft of this guy being a first-round pick. All the talking heads loved him. All the everyone who followed the draft seemed to think this guy was a stud. For as young as he was, as well as he did while he was at Baylor, he just seemed to be. And everyone has kind of been ready to move on from Pecco. He just seems to be a perfect fit for Bengals fans. And here's a guy who's finally going to get a chance. And same with the William Jackson thing. The one thing that really hurts is, as good as he's done for camp and during camp, you don't get to see him in a game because he's obviously going to miss Friday. Who knows how many air games he's going to miss. And that's just the one, probably the most frustrating thing, is just the idea that he's not going to get the chance to make that push. Because in games, he's not going to get a chance to push Pecco or push any of the other people ahead of him for playing time, with the Bengals notoriously not giving a whole lot of playing time to the defensive rookies in their first year, like they did with Drake Kirkpatrick, like they did with Darqueze Dennard. How they just, after you in the first round, go to the bench. Here's someone I think a lot of Bengals fans are kind of hoping secretly, well, he'll be the one exception. And of course, if you can't play, you as Ted was saying, you're not going to make the team in the tub or whatever that saying was from Zimmer. Which is a point that he's going to have a hard time fighting, get on the field, and break that Bengals, practice or mantra of not playing you if you can't get on there. And I think that's the worst thing, is not him not getting a chance to prove it on the one, I guess, positive is, if there is, there's never a thing that was a positive, but the one nice thing is, of all the positions, and this is something we mentioned last week in our podcast, is that defensive tackle is one of the stronger positions on the team. They have Geno Atkins, who's obviously one of the top tackles in the NFL today. And then with him, you have Pecco, who had a solid rebound year last year. Pat Sims played really well when he had a chance. They have Brandon Thompson, who should probably be back from the PUP list in time. So you've got couple big guys right behind Pecco, and then you have they drafted Marcus Hardison recently, so you have another one there, and then you have Deshaun Williams. So they have enough solid bodies, and if Billings wasn't going to get on the field, it's not as devastating as it could have been. I mean, it's obviously not losing AJ Green or Dalton. So from that in the grand scheme of things, it's not as bad as it could be, especially if it's short term. It just really hurts your depth and hurts anything you want to try to do with the defensive line. And the biggest thing is, it keeps him from having a chance to show that he should be higher up in the depth chart. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, what are they going to do now with Sims and with Thompson? You can probably assume they're both going to make it now. If any of them was a potential cut down day, casualty. They're probably going to make it depend on the severity. And if it's not bad enough, they might just put Billings. Like I could see them putting him on the pup just because they have all that depth. So it will be kind of interesting to see what the news is this injury, how it is, and then what they do with it. Because I'd love to see him in preseason, but at this point it seems kind of iffy if we'll get to see him.
I definitely think it shakes up the locker room. I mean, the fan base wanted to kind of write off Brandon Thompson and assume the Bengals were going to put him on PUP, but I think that's definitely something that the Bengals are going to have to look at. And I think that the mindset that, oh, well, we have so many defensive tackles, let's just put one of them on PUP. I don't really think that's how NFL teams really think. So it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah, and it's a shame because, all of a sudden this 2016 draft class is kind of dropping like flies a little bit. I mean, it's like, oh, man, another injury, another guy that, Jackson wasn't necessarily slated for a big role on defense. We talked about that last week, and one of the things I said, I think it's kind of the same thing with Billings. He probably wasn't going to start. His role would probably be more prominent than Jackson, but I think Billings would have been a more heavy rotator in the defense than Jackson, and I think even though he wasn't a starter, I think this is more of a blow from an emotional standpoint to the team. Some reports had, players taking a knee as he was getting carted off, and it seemed like a pretty serious thing at the time. Now, again, a tweet from Jeff Hobson of Bengals.com noted that they think the Bengals training staff has cautious optimism, and they think at most there could be a cartilage tear. I don't know the time frame on that in terms of recovery, but it sounds far less severe than a ligament being damaged, which we've seen around the league with a number of players so far already. And if you remember last year, there was a big scare with Michael Johnston just after he was brought back in with free agency, and he crumpled down on one of the first training practices of the year, and he ended up coming back and playing for the Bengals throughout the season. So let's hope that's kind of a similar situation. Let's hope that the Bengals do not have any more injury scares, especially to some of their more important people going forward here in 2016. One other little injury update, Tyler Eifert. There was an interesting piece of information given out by Jay Morrison of the Dayton Daily News. Tyler Eifert, it was once believed that the surgery to his ankle that he's currently recovering from was on the outside of the ankle, and that would have a specific time window of recovery where we've been hearing that he would be back maybe week 1, week 2, maybe a little bit beyond that, but should play most of the season. Now Jay Morrison has said that they noted scars on the inside of his ankle, and certain doctors and things like that, we have information of this up on Cincy Jungle. There might be a little more time being missed with that. So a little bit of some enigma there, and we need to kind of keep monitoring that. But some good news, Connor, with the tight end position is that C.J. Uzomah, along with Brandon LaFell, have been playing very well in practices, especially recently. LaFell's been making some plays. C.J. Uzomah is making a lot of plays as a pass catcher. What are your thoughts on those two, their growth that we've been seeing over the past couple of days in training camp practice, and how they might need to step up to help this offense out if guys continue to keep hitting the injury bug?
I mean, yeah, it's a bummer that the team has gotten, hit with all these injuries all of a sudden, but you can't really hope for any better news than what you're hearing right now with LaFell and Uzomah. Obviously, Eifert is going to be a huge loss if he's gone, even for one game of the season, let alone for maybe 4 or 5. And then with Croft, still, I believe he's dealing with something or has dealt with something. That's also an issue. But with Uzomah performing well, or reportedly, which obviously reports are just reports until we see it in preseason, but it's good to see that he's progressing. I think the Bengals really want to utilize him, and I think it almost verifies my my bold prediction. I don't know if it was one of our trial runs, but I was like, maybe Uzomah will outperform Tyler Croft in the preseason. I think that's looking pretty good right now. But ultimately, I think what it's going to come down to is that Uzomah in terms of the Bengals tight end depth chart, it really couldn't have gotten any better for them in terms of, like, obviously they got hurt, but Uzomah is mostly going to back up Eifert. He's probably not going to be on the field at the same time as Eifert ever, and so he's more of a pass catcher, whereas Croft is much more of a run blocker, although Croft is pretty good at catching as well. But I'm pretty sure I recall draft analysts calling Croft the best blocking tight end in his draft class. So that's one thing the Bengals have got, is that, you know, when Eifert and Croft will potentially both be healthy, that they can be on the field together and work in those two tight end sets and really complement each other in the passing game as well as the run game. But with having a guy like Uzomah potentially step up would be huge for the Bengals in Eifert's absence, as obviously the team is desperate for some pass catching help. And I mean, as I've said before, I think that's kind of blown out of proportion. I think that A.J. Green's going to pick up the slack, and maybe the run game will get back to where it was in 2014. But regardless, having LaFell reportedly playing well, which is something we all really hope for with all the cynicism coming out of the New England Patriot fan base. But and having Uzomah performing well, I think it's definitely something that's encouraging. I think the offense is something to look forward to.
Yeah, those are two positions that obviously the Bengals need to have their new players step up, or newer players step up, because of injuries, because of attrition and free agency, things like that. So those are some camp updates, some major camp updates. Again, some good, some negative, mostly in terms of injury. There were some reports also that in the joint practice with the Vikings, the Bengals didn't play very well in those practices. I mean, at this point, it's kind of like, well, who cares as long as guys are healthy? And let's hope for the best with Andrew Billings, because I think he could be a very good player for the Bengals and a very solid rotator for the Bengals. So keep a good thought for the big guy there. Before we get to your fantasy football insider, Scott, and I will start with you, give me one player you'll be watching closely in preseason game number 1, and one thing that you'll be looking for out of the Bengals, aside from being injury-free, obviously. I think that goes without saying. So give me one player you're looking for, you'll be watching very closely, whether it's a starter or a reserve, whoever, and one thing you're hoping to see out of the Bengals in their first preseason game with the Vikings.
I think the one thing, starting with the second part first, that I'm looking for or thing I'll be watching for, is that offensive line getting some push or some blocking. They have just been dreadful. All the reports from camp this past week were they were just getting blown up by the Bengals defensive line. And so I was kind of hoping, everyone's kind of saying, well, they have Dunlap, they have Atkins, so okay, yeah, they're going up against some pretty good guys. And then the consensus, okay, well, we'll see what happens when the Vikings come to town. We'll see if it gets any better. And everything I've heard from the joint practices is it's not gotten any better. Dalton's been getting a lot of they can't hit him, but they've been getting a lot of pressure on him. They can't get any push. They can't get any running. So that's the thing I want to see, is can they give Dalton and McCarron and Wenning, or whoever they end up using Friday, a chance to throw the ball, and is Hill going to have anywhere to run? I know he struggled last year, and some of the arguments were, well, was it him? Was it Bodine? Was it play? Whatever it was, I just want to see this offensive line look like the top 5, top 10 unit. I think a lot of us think they are. So that's the thing I'm going to be watching, is what the O-line can do. Probably the one player I want to be watching is probably one who, just because he's a wide receiver, and I think we had mentioned him in the past. Someone a lot of fans seem to like, whether it's justified or not, is Jake Kumaro. Just because he had a good camp last year, he was on the practice squad. We were really surprised he made it to the Bengals practice squad last year. I just want to see what is he going to do in a game now that he's kind of had his second year. He's had a whole year of the practices, of being on the roster. If he's going to make the roster, it seems like this would be his chance to do it. This is his time to really show, is he worth all the hype? Are we just kind of excited because a big kid from a small school, or does it feel good story, or is he someone who can really make the NFL? And that's something I think the one guy I really want to see is, can he get open? Can he catch the ball as well as he can in drills and practices?
Yeah, Connor, great point, Scott. Connor, one guy you're looking at in this first preseason game, and one thing you're looking for out of the Bengals in this first preseason game, aside, as I mentioned, aside from keeping injury free.
Yeah, I'll kind of piggyback off Scott. This isn't necessarily my guy, but I also think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Rashawn Simonize. As Scott mentioned, with the whole Jay Kumaro thing, is Kumaro's coming from a small school. What's that going to be like? And as someone who attended Azusa Pacific with Terrell Watson, it was fascinating to see Terrell really put on a clinic in the preseason. I was really bummed that the Bengals let him go. I think he should start in Cleveland. And I think that those small school guys are definitely important to keep an eye on. I think Simonize is the exact same specimen as Kumaro, but he has a lot more experience and I think a lot more versatility than the former, just because he's played in so many different areas. He's played different styles. We've seen so many Canadian athletes come and make an impact in the NFL, from Cameron Wake to Jarrell Freeman to guys in other camps. I saw a guy in Chargers camp, Dexter McCoyle, who's a 6'4" safety, kind of like Iloka, who's all over the place. I think that people are sleeping on Rashawn Simonize, basically, and obviously it's towards him just because he's one of my boys, because I interviewed him and he seems like an awesome dude, but at the end of the day, he's a lot more agile than Kumaro from what I've seen. And if your best attribute when you're a back end of the roster receiver is your hands, it's probably not a great sign, because you're going to need to basically create separation in order to gain confidence from your quarterback and basically make plays. I think that Simonize has that lateral agility that makes him a valuable asset as a deep threat receiver. Or I should say, not a deep threat, but, well, I mean, he could be a deep threat, but I think as a big man, it's really important to be able to create separation. The hands are something that is kind of expected out of a big receiver, but I think being able to separate is something that is really going to be important for Kumaro and Simonize, but I think Simonize kind of has the upper hand now, at least in my eyes. But the one guy, sorry, I sidetracked there, but the one guy I'm definitely going to keep my eye on is George Iloka. As we mentioned, he obviously had those little we had that little brief courtship with the Vikings, but he ended up signing in Cincinnati. And from all accounts, he's been all over the place, making plays in training camp, perhaps going even a little too hard with the whole, blowing up plays to the point where his coaches are saying, all right, you gotta slow down, and just people saying that he practices harder than anyone they've ever seen practice before, which I really think is awesome. And I'm just excited to see what he's going to look like in his new role. I think he's going to probably take the center fielder. Well, I mean, obviously they play too deep, but I think he's going to be more responsible for covering more ground, like Reggie Nelson was when Iloka and Nelson were in the backfield, as Sean Williams kind of transitions into his role in the defense. I think that it's going to be really interesting to see Iloka team up with Drake Kirkpatrick and Adam Jones. We all saw the Jones intentionally bite on a play last year against the Rams and basically give Iloka a free shot at an easy interception, which he ended up picking off for his only pick of the year. I think some of those cues that he'll have with the corners, and obviously it probably isn't going to happen in the preseason game, but I think that it'll be really interesting to see how Paul Guenther utilizes him as kind of the primary safety of the defense in a way. And I mean, I guess as the whole concept, I would say, like an entity that I'm looking for, definitely for me is just going to be special teams. I think that's a huge aspect that a lot of fans really overlook in preseason, and it's really, really, really important coming from someone who's been at a training camp every single day this offseason. I think that coaches really, really, really value players who can perform on special teams, especially in the back end of the roster. It can't really be overstated that guys who are getting first-team reps on special teams are going to be the guys that are making the roster, because unless a guy has so much promise at his position that a coach thinks that he can be a starter in 2 or 3 years, or probably 1 or 2 years if we're being honest, I think that the guy who performs now with special teams prowess is going to be the guy that makes the team. The Bengals had one of the best special teams units in the NFL last year, and I don't think that they're going to want to let that blow up, because you see what happens with teams when special teams fail. I know last year San Diego had terrible special teams. They drafted a new punter. They are hoping that their special teams is going to help come together now, because it's just one of those things that fans never seem to even consider. Yet the battle of field position is one of the most important reasons why the Bengals had such a hot start last year that no one seemed to talk about was that Kevin Huber was punting people deep. The Gunners were making plays on punts, and then obviously the return men. When Adam Jones was hot, when Brandon Tate would make a nice play or two. I mean, even in the Arizona game, he made that one great return that got called back. Those plays are the kind of plays that puts a team from a tie game to a win, or brings a team back from a 3-point deficit. I think those things can't get overstated. I'm really excited to see what happens on special teams, because there's so much more that goes into it than what you see on the field. There's so much coaching that goes on behind the scenes that fans don't really get to see.
Yeah, and if you look back, I was rewatching quite a bit of tape of the Bengals from last season, and in that Seattle game, if you remember, Kevin Huber and Darqueze Dennard, who didn't have a great defensive game that afternoon, pinned the Seahawks deep a couple of times, which was actually huge for the Bengals to kind of mount their comeback in that game. So I agree with you on the special teams thing. One thing I'm looking for, aside from the team remaining healthy, I think I'm kind of with Scott. I want to see the run game. I want to see some push up front. I think we know what we're going to get with the pass rush. I think 2014 was kind of an anomaly there. I think they're going to be pretty stout there. I think there's going to be a couple of good players on defense that'll stand out at least early on. But there's going to be, aside from the offensive line push and the running game, a guy I'm really going to watch, because I think it'll probably change as the preseason goes on, but I think he's going to get a lot of time early on, is Tyler Boyd. And it's probably a pretty obvious choice, but I think they're going to give him significant snaps as this first game goes on, and he's going to play a lot of different roles. So that's a guy I'll be watching at least through this first game, just to kind of see his comfortability with the offense and how his chemistry with Andy Dalton has developed at least early on. So those are the news and notes from training camp, and the things we'll be looking for in this preseason game number 1, as well as the players we'll be watching. It's time now to give the spotlight to Scott Schulze, who, by the way, I've been mispronouncing his name for the past couple of weeks, so I apologize, Scott. I just thought it was Schulze, and I mispronounced it for a couple of weeks. I apologize about that, but it's Schulze.
Teachers, and yes, Schulze. I've had years of teachers and coworkers and everyone butcher it so long that I don't even notice it anymore. But after listening to the podcast a few times, I should probably mention that to Anthony.
You're probably shaking your fist in anger, I'm sure, when you listen. So I apologize. Again, this is the weekly segment, the Orange and Black Insider, Fantasy Football Insider, with Scott Schulze, who last week talked about the running backs, and this week is going to talk about the quarterbacks. So, Scott, the floor is yours. Give us some fantasy advice, because, as you know, I'm going to jump into your league and use this advice against you.
And dominate, probably, because it is half luck.
That's right.
So, as Anthony said, last week we talked about the running backs. This week, I just have 3 quick points I wanted to mention about quarterbacks. One thing that I cannot stress enough is to read your league's scoring before you draft. Every league's a little different. Do you get points per reception? Do you get these silly bonus plays? Do you have field goals that count more than 3 points in some situations? We're talking about quarterbacks this week, so really look and see, do you get 4 points or 6 points for a passing touchdown? Most leagues do 4. Some, they'll get cute, they'll give 6. They might even give points per completion, or whatever your commissioners decide. Sometimes the commissioners have too much time and they just want to add bonus points here. Anyway, look and see what you get and how many points you get for your scoring. And the big thing with the passing touchdowns is if you get 4 points, which is generally standard, what you'll see is your running quarterbacks, your guys like Russell Wilson, Cam Newton, have a lot more value because they're getting more points from the running game. And even someone like a Fitzpatrick who runs here and there, and even Cutler runs a little bit, their value goes up a little bit in proportion. Now, if you get 6 points per touchdown, the guys like the Tony Romos, the Carson Palmer, Tom Brady, and the guys who, if you're lucky, are going to run for 5 yards on the season, but throw a lot, they're going to have a little more value. So just one thing to keep in mind, it never hurts to look at your points and see how you're going to be scored before you pick people. Okay, on to the second point we had for the week. Peyton Manning, 2000 to 2003, he averaged 29 touchdowns. In 2004, he had the incredible 49 touchdown performance, set the NFL record, and then from 2005 to 2010, went back to 30 touchdowns a season. Tom Brady, 2001 to 2005, averaged about 25 touchdowns. And then in 2007, upped Manning's record and had 50 touchdowns. And then after that, he had a return to 28. He's been around 28 or 30 pretty much since then. The big point is don't chase last year's touchdowns. It's very rare for a quarterback to have just a monster season like that. When they do, they generally don't repeat it. And one of the reasons I mention that is Cam Newton. He averaged about 20, 21 touchdowns a year going into last year, and all of a sudden last year has 35 touchdowns. So like 60% higher than he'd ever had historically. And he still only threw for like 3,800 yards and completed under 60% of his passes. So if history shows anything, he's probably not going to get 35 again. I think a lot of people are drafting him really high, expecting he's going to be a 30, 35 touchdown guy. And I'm not saying he won't be, just historically, that doesn't seem to hold. And then another example of that would be Carson Palmer. Last year, he set career highs in touchdowns and yards. Dude's 35 years old. He's not getting any younger. We've seen he does have an injury history. So he's probably not going to hit that again. So just when you do draft quarterbacks, just don't be chasing last year's production, but kind of look at what you think they're going to do this year, because it's very rare that they keep that kind of performance up year after year. And the third point that I wanted to mention on fantasy football quarterbacks is, speaking of guys like Palmer and Newton, and then if you look at the kind of the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks that are going this year, you have guys like Rodgers and Cam Newton and Russell Wilson and Andrew Luck and the top 4 or 5, and I think Breeze is up there. And interestingly, after you get past that top 5 or 6, the next 10, 12 quarterbacks, based on the projections, are pretty much the same. I mean, there's not a whole lot of drop from guys like Rivers and Eli Manning and Carson and Derek Carr and Tannehill and Matt Ryan and Dalton and Brady and Fitzpatrick. All those guys, they're roughly about the same. You go to different sites, they're okay, one's a little higher, one's a little lower, but they're kind of in that same group. So the point is, if you don't take one of the first 5 quarterbacks, you can probably wait quite a while. You can probably wait till like round 9 or 10 to get your starter, which I know some people would really freak out if they waited that long. It's kind of a unique situation because you can get like a Tannehill or a Romo or someone, a hell of a lot later. Let someone go ahead and grab, Palmer or Eli in round 5 or 6 and just wait 4 or 5 rounds and grab someone who's just as good. Now, obviously, it's like they say with like the stocks and the mutual funds, I'm not guaranteeing this will happen. So if you do this and you lose, you can blame Anthony or Connor, but not me.
Yeah, I'll be the scapegoat. Appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem.
But if you feel comfortable doing that, I mean, if you recognize, point wise, Romo, Dalton, Winston, Tannehill, I really don't care who I have. I think they're all gonna be the same. If you're comfortable with that and just getting whoever falls to you, I'd say go ahead and try it. See who's there in round 9 or 10. But if you really need to have your guy, need to have your quarterback, and you don't feel comfortable doing that, don't do it. From past experience, that's what I tend to be the last guy in my league to take quarterback, and I usually, grab someone like that, and it's worked really well. So it's just this year it's going to work, I think, amazingly well, unless you're in a league where they start drafting backups really quick. I've been in some leagues where they'll start drafting backups in round 6 or 7. If they do that, then okay, that wouldn't be a good strategy because then you're going to get stuck with like Jeff Goff or somebody, or RG3. But if you're in a normal league, just something to consider, just something to toss. Maybe if you don't get one of those top few guys, just kind of linger, kind of hang around, wait, and to see who falls to you, in round 8, 9, or 10. And, for Romo or Dalton or Tannehill or someone there, then, hey, scoop them up and use those picks to get depth at positions like running back or receiver, and hopefully we'll be in the championship. Unless you're in my league, then obviously I want to be in the championship game. But any league where I'm not in,
Yeah, buy low, hope for the best. I mean, Dalton and Bortles last year were 2 of the highest fantasy scores, and they both generally went undrafted for the most part. So.
Yeah,
Yeah, you see that every year. A lot like
go ahead, Scott.
no, I was going to say that you see that kind of every year. You see these guys who usually might be the 10th, 11th, 12th guy taken. Luck, when he had his big year, he was kind of low. Aaron Rodgers' breakout year, he was usually like the 10th or 11th quarterback taken. Uh, yeah, a lot of these guys just go. You can get really good value if you wait, especially if you use those picks wisely. Now, if you're picking like a defense or a kicker in the fifth, sixth round instead of that quarterback, okay, you don't deserve to win. But if you're using it to get good depth at running back or wide receiver, then yeah, go for it. See what
Do
happens.
that.
Yeah, I've actually drafted Andy Dalton a number of times in late rounds in these 10, 12 team leagues, and it's usually come with pretty solid results. Even though because so many people that are non-Bengals fans have this certain perception of Dalton, and they just let him go throughout the draft, and he ends up actually producing pretty well for the most part. So yeah, but that is the Fantasy Football Insider with Scott Schulze. And it's courtesy of the Orange and Black Insider, which is presented by Cincy Jungle, of course. So, Scott, thank you for the sage advice. I can't wait to use it against you. It's time now for another segment we've been doing weekly, and it's the Bengals Hater of the Week. Initially, in our inaugural episode, it was Colin Cowherd of Fox Sports, who is a notorious Bengals basher, whether it was with Fox or with ESPN in his previous gig. He really likes to bang on the Bengals pretty hard, and that there was a couple of things. So check out episode number 1 about that. Last week we had a couple of guys, Dave Damashek of NFL Network and Frank Schwab of Yahoo Sports, who were slinging a little bit of mud at the Bengals. And this week, it's not so much at the team itself, but the hater of the week is John Breech of CBS Sports, who has also been a bit critical of the Bengals in recent years and recent posts of his, and he has one that ranks the fan bases around the league. Now, in fairness to where I'm at, I don't think he's too far off, but it is still a slight against the Bengals, and we have to call out John Breech of CBS Sports because of his slighting of the Bengals fan base, and he ranks them at number 18 overall. It's almost kind of like how the media ranks their quarterbacks. It's almost kind of the Dalton ranking in terms of fan bases. So, Connor, your thoughts on Breech's comments about the Bengals? Obviously, he pointed out some of their more famous fans, Woody Harrelson, George Clooney. Those are some of their famous fans. But he points out their bad 1990s era and obviously their playoff failures. So any thoughts on this week's Hater of the Week in John Breech of CBS Sports?
Yeah, so for those who missed it, he basically said it's a minor miracle that the Bengals have any fans left after the 1990s. And then he throws in the condescending, thankfully the Bengals fans who didn't jump ship in the 90s have been in a row with 25 straight years with no playoff wins. Wait, that's not a record. That's not a reward. Oh, okay, well, great writing, man. You had me, head over heels laughing. Couldn't really say anything else. That wasn't that funny, but come on. I mean, that's the thing is basically that the Bengals are obviously going to just be anyone who makes any sort of rankings Bengals related is just going to throw them right in the middle of the pile and hope that no one notices, because that's generally how people seem to view the Bengals these days. And the whole bash about 25 straight years with no playoff wins. Well, look, the Jaguars were founded in the mid 90s or a couple years before that. They started off their existence with a 4-12 season followed by 4 straight playoff years. And in those 4 playoff years, they won a couple playoff games. I think they made it to 2 AFC championships. But if you're to ask fans who is a better team over the past 25 years, just random NFL fans, I would guess that 90% would say the Bengals have been the more successful team. Because ultimately, winning 1 playoff game, what is that going to do for the Bengals? Like, a good year is generally just going to go forgotten unless it ends up with a Super Bowl trophy or a Lombardi trophy or a Super Bowl. Because, I mean, that's ultimately what the goal is for these teams, right? Like, I hate it when people ask me the question, is Marvin Lewis done if the Bengals don't win a playoff game this year? No, he's not, because the Bengals value Marvin Lewis and they're loyal to him. But that shouldn't even matter, because the question shouldn't be, Are the Bengals going to win a playoff game this year? Are they going to win the Super Bowl? Sure, they've had struggles winning a playoff game, but ultimately it just is going to come down to who's hoisting the Lombardi Trophy in February. Anything short of that is a bitter disappointment. And to just knock the fans for the fact that Woody Harrelson or George Clooney is a team's favorite or biggest fan. Oh, sorry, we don't have Jay-Z, but why would having Jay-Z on your side make you a better fan base? And the Brooklyn Nets don't exactly have the best fans in the world. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't two and two don't add up in this equation right here. So, congratulations, Breech, on your fantastic journalism. I'm actually now a CBS subscriber for because you've earned my subscription if CBS even has a subscription.
Any additional thoughts, Scott?
Yeah, first off, when I saw the who wrote it, I was kind of surprised because if you're named Breech, you really have no business slamming the Bengals.
That's what I thought too. That's what I thought too.
I thought it was Jim Breech because I saw Jay Breech. I'm like, Jim Breech wrote this? There's no way. But yeah, I don't know if he's his son, his cousin, uncle. I don't know who he is, but if he's related to Jim Breech, and even if he's not, I'm going to assume he is. And just for that, you can't slam the Bengals if your name's Breech. That's like being named a Sison and slamming them, or Collinsworth. There's certain names you just can't.
Those guys tend to do it actually pretty frequently themselves too. But so
yeah, after I said that, I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh, wait a minute.
One other thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
Connor had a good point. He mentioned the Jaguars, and one really good point about that is they have won playoff games. But if you look at the one team that, every year, who is the one team other than the Raiders, because they have the whole LA, Oakland, Las Vegas thing. The one team they always talk about is the Jaguars because they just can't draw any of their games. So it's a newer team. It's you don't have the cold weather. You don't have the freezing temperatures where people don't want to go outside. You did have some early success, and they can't get anyone to go to the games. Bengals on their hand, like you said, okay, you've gone 25 years without winning. You had a decade or without winning a playoff game. You did have a rough decade, but yet, you had the fans still show up. You still have a lot of games where people are showing up. They're not always like they had a period where they weren't always sold out, but they have for the most part have done a pretty good job, and the voters of Hamilton County gave them that crazy whatever you want to call it stadium deal because they wanted the team to stay. So that shows a lot of now whether it was financially reasonable, I don't. That's another issue. But the fact that they voted for them to stay, and to me that's loyal fans. Hey, yeah, we know, and that was before they really had all this big winning. So this is right after that decade in the 90s. Hey, we had this horrible stretch of winning, but we still want you here, and we're going to give you this crazy deal. So to say that these fans are no good because they have because Nick Lachey likes them, or I don't know, that just makes no sense.
Yeah, I omitted. What's up, Connor?
You're good. Go for it.
Nick Lachey was another one of those celebrity names that they added in on the list there, and it's hard to. I think some of the points that Breech was making actually played into what the national audience saw when the Bengals played the Steelers on the wild card game, and there were people throwing beer cans at Ben Roethlisberger as he was being carted off of the field and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure that kind of stuff also kind of plays into it. But overall, John Breech has earned his plaque now with Colin Cowherd, Frank Schwab, and Dave Damashek in our Haters of the Week for this week. So congratulations, John. I'm sure you'll be having a beer on.
And for what it's worth, the Steelers fans were. Yeah, for what it's worth, the Steelers fans were. I think 4 of them went to jail because they were beating up women or something like that.
Most definitely.
Yeah, great fans.
Most definitely. We're going to close up shop here, but we do have a big announcement. The show is now officially on iTunes, so you can find the Orange and Black Insider on iTunes as it is right now. You can also download and watch the show on Cincy Jungle directly from the posts we're also breaking this show up into different segments to have them be a little bit more digestible if you want the fantasy football info, if you want some news and notes, all that good stuff. But we are on iTunes now. We've had some requests about that, and we've made it available to you through that. You can also check us out on SoundCloud and things like that too. So big news for us. I kind of feel I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit. I kind of feel like we're now official because we are part of the Apple community now. So guys, congratulations. And
it's like that blue check mark on Twitter.
That's right. I'm still waiting on that though. So
give me that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll wait on that one. But for now, I'll take that the Orange and Black Insider is on iTunes. So download it. Check it out on the website, and let us know what you think. That's going to probably wrap it up for us. We had a great interview with Ted Glover of the Daily Norseman, talking about the Vikings and the Bengals and their preseason game coming up here. So big thanks to Ted, and you heard all the ways you can follow him earlier in the episode. So check out his stuff. Check out the stuff this week, at least, with the Daily Norseman for the Bengals and Vikings coverage of preseason game 1. We ran through news and notes. We gave you the hater of the week. We gave you some sage fantasy football advice that I'm jotting down to use against Scott as I get invited to his league. So
invite me too, man.
Yeah, that's right. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks again to Ted Glover of the Daily Norseman. This has been the Orange and Black Insider Episode 3, presented by Cincy Jungle. And check out all the stuff that we've been putting up, not only just us on this show, but many others behind the scenes as well that are putting up great content on Cincy Jungle that are following training camp, all of the news and notes that are going on. So check that stuff out. For Scott Schulze, Connor Howe, I'm Anthony Cosenza for the Orange and Black Insider presented by Cincy Jungle. Have a good one, and hoo-day.
Hoo-day.
Hoo-day.